Hello and welcome to another edition of Movement Breaks with Mr. Hassel. Today's movement break is Whose Favorite Is It? Narragansett Elementary School Edition. The NES specialists have answered a survey with a few of their favorite things. Your job is to guess whose favorite is it. Perform the exercise when you make your decision. Make sure you have enough space, get ready, and let's go! Who said, "My favorite food is potatoes"? Was it Mrs. Marcotte, Mrs. Hamill, or Mr. Hassel? It was Mrs. Hamill. Who played basketball in high school? Was it Miss Hummel, Miss Catanzaro, or Mr. Hassel? It was Mr. Hassel. Whose favorite kids movie is Finding Nemo? Mrs. Marcotte, Mrs. Festa, or Mr. Jennings? Mrs. Marcotte. Two people said this. My favorite restaurant is the Muse. Was it Mrs. Festa and Mrs. Bryce, Mrs. Marcotte and Miss Hummel, or Mrs. Marcotte and Mrs. Hamill? Mrs. Festa and Mrs. Bryce. Whose favorite color is pink? Miss Hummel, Mrs. Hamill, or Mrs. Bryce? Miss Hummel. Whose favorite hobby is dominoes? Mrs. Festa, Mr. Hassel, or Mr. Jennings? Mr. Jennings. Whose favorite restaurant is Brickley's? Miss Hummel, Mrs. Festa, or Mrs. Bryce? Miss Hummel. Whose favorite food is chocolate? Mrs. Hamill, Miss Catanzaro, or Mr. Hassel? Mrs. Catanzaro. Whose hobby is video games? Mrs. Hamill, Mrs. Marcotte, or Mr. Jennings? Mrs. Hamill. We're about halfway done. Two people said this. My favorite cartoon is SpongeBob. Was it your PE teachers, Mrs. Festa and Mr. Hassel, or Mr. Jennings and Mrs. Bryce? Mrs. Festa and Mr. Hassel. Whose favorite animal is an elephant? Miss Hummel, Mrs. Marcotte, or Mrs. Catanzaro? Mrs. Marcotte. Whose favorite board game is Trouble? Mrs. Hamill, Mr. Hassel, or Mrs. Bryce? Mrs. Bryce. Here's a tricky one. Whose hidden talent is that they can talk to animals? Miss Hummel, Mrs. Festa, or Mr. Jennings? Miss Hummel can talk to animals. Whose favorite movie is Minions? Mrs. Hamill, Mrs. Marcotte, or Mr. Jennings? Mr. Jennings. There are 3 more left. Who used to play the clarinet? Mrs. Catanzaro, Mr. Hassel, or Mrs. Festa? Mrs. Catanzaro. Whose favorite ice cream flavor is vanilla with fudge? Mrs. Hamill, Mrs. Marcotte, or Mrs. Festa? Mrs. Festa. And finally, whose hidden talent is juggling? Miss Hummel, Mr. Hassel, or Mrs. Bryce? Mr. Hassel. Great job, everybody! Hope you had fun and enjoy the rest of your day.